Today, we're diving into the life of Rainer Maria Rilke, who is, without a doubt, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. But we're not just going to talk about his poems. We're going to try to uncover the man himself, a person who was way more complex and honestly way more fascinating than the myths that surround him.
And you know, the biggest myth of all, it actually starts with how he died. It's a story so perfectly poetic, it almost feels like it was scripted, like an ending you'd write for a character in a novel, not something that happens in real life.
I bet you've heard this one. It's the legend that's pretty much defined Rilke for generations. It's this romantic, almost beautiful end for a man who spent his life obsessed with beauty. It's a really powerful image, and it's stuck around for a reason. But what's the real story?
Yeah, that's the thing about powerful images, right? We really want them to be true. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this legend and get to the reality of what actually happened.
So, let's start right there, with the most famous story of all. It's time to separate the romantic fiction from the often painful facts. So, the truth is, that whole rose thorn story, it isn't quite right. I mean, the medical records are very clear. Rilke died from a really aggressive form of leukemia. It had basically caused his immune system to completely collapse. Now, he did prick his finger on a thorn, but that tiny little wound just became an infection his body had absolutely no power to fight. The reality wasn't poetic at all. It was cold, it was medical, and it was painful.
So where did this myth get all its power? You're not going to believe this. From Rilke himself. Before he died, he wrote this exact epitaph for his own gravestone. By putting the rose right there at his final resting place, he basically co-authored his own legend. He let the world choose a poetic death over a painful one. And his tension, this tug-of-war between the image and the reality, it wasn't just a thing at the end of his life. It was the central conflict of his entire life, a constant battle between this deep yearning for love and a desperate, almost primal need for solitude.
At the very heart of this conflict was one extraordinary woman, Lou Andreas Salome, and she was so much more than a lover. She was his intellectual mentor, a real powerhouse. She's the one who introduced him to Russia and Tolstoy. She even convinced him to change his name from the softer-sounding René to the much stronger Rainer, helping to literally forge the artistic identity that we know today.
And this was his core dilemma. On one hand, Rilke craved this incredibly deep connection, but on the other, he was absolutely terrified that if he gave himself completely to another person, it would just smother his creative fire. This fear made him wander restlessly all across Europe, always creating distance in his relationships, always caught between the need for love and the need for solitude to create his art. But here's the thing that makes Rilke a genius. He didn't just suffer through this inner paralysis. He found a way to transform it into some of the most powerful poetry ever written.
In his famous book, Letters to a Young Poet, he gave this exact advice. He said, don't rush for answers. Don't try to force your own growth. Instead, you have to embrace the patient, quiet strength of solitude. For Rilke, see, loneliness wasn't some disease that needed to be cured. It was the sacred workshop where the self gets built.
And you can really feel that philosophy in his iconic poem, The Panther. Just try to imagine this animal, trapped in a cage at a Paris zoo. Its whole world has been reduced to just an endless repetition of bars passing by. Its vision is so exhausted that it literally cannot even perceive a world beyond its cage anymore. This line, right here, this is the core of it. You have this immense, powerful force pacing in the smallest possible circle. It's this dance of strength, but right at its very center is a will that has been totally numbed, paralyzed by its confinement. It's the perfect metaphor for Rilke's own contained, trapped creative energy.
And here's the haunting conclusion. An image from the outside world finally manages to break through. It travels through the panther's tense, silent body, and then it's just extinguished. It ceases to be. It dies in his heart. The outer world is literally consumed by the artist's powerful inner state.
So through this poem, Rilke does something absolutely incredible. He turns the panther into what Germans call a Kunstding, which means an art object. He takes a living, breathing animal and he freezes it in time, elevating it into this eternal symbol of contained power, a being that now exists completely outside of reality itself.
This ability to transform reality into art, it really reached its peak in this one explosive moment of creativity, but it came after a decade of agonizing silence.
So back in 1912, he's walking on a cliffside at Duino Castle, and this voice, this first line,
just comes to him in a fierce wind. It was the beginning of his masterpiece. But then, nothing. World War I broke out, and for 10 long years, Rilke was plunged into a deep depression, completely unable to write.
So what could possibly break a 10-year silence for a poet of his stature? Tragically, it was a death. Rilke found out that a young friend of his, a brilliant dancer named Werner Knoop, had died from a rare disease at just 19 years old. And this tragedy sparked what can only be described as a creative miracle. He started writing poems to process his grief for Vera, and in just a few days, those poems completely exploded into the masterful cycle, the Sonnets to Orpheus. And what's truly incredible is that same creative hurricane, as he called it, gave him the energy to finally complete the Duino Elegies, the masterpiece that had been haunting him for a decade. All in the same week, a single death gave birth to two of the greatest works of modern literature. Just amazing.
So what does this all mean? How does a poet's life of wandering and grief and creativity, how does that connect to us now? Well, the answer lies in one final, brilliant reinterpretation of a classic myth.
We all know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, right? The guy who goes to the underworld to get his dead wife back. But Rilke just flips it on its head. In his version, it's not a tragic love story. It's a profound meditation on identity. Orpheus becomes the artist's ego, who only sees Eurydice as something to possess for his art. And in death, she is finally free from his gaze, becoming her own complete being. And Hermes, the guide, he represents the artistic form, the medium that the artist has to respect.
Rilke's description of this new Eurydice is so powerful. He doesn't say she was a ghost or a shade. No, he says she was already a root. She was no longer defined by her husband. She had become something universal, elemental, and totally self-sufficient, connected to the earth itself.
And this reveals the poem's deepest lesson. The artist, Orpheus, he desperately wants to possess the essence of his subject, Eurydice. But the moment he turns back, the moment he tries to grab that essence directly instead of trusting his art, his medium, he loses her forever. It's a powerful metaphor for art and for love, really. The second you try to control and possess someone, you lose the very thing that was essential about them in the first place.
Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative question for you. Rilke translated the people he loved into timeless art. Werner Knoop is forever 19 in his sonnets. Eurydice is forever a root in his poem. So think about this. If your life, your identity, were translated into someone else's memory or their art, would you still be you, or would you become something entirely new? What art object will your life become?